Good evening, everyone. It gives me great pleasure to welcome you to The Power of the Pen, our penultimate event in the Young Young Lawyers Making Change Festival. I'm Lucie Boase. I'm a trainee solicitor at Hodge Jones and Allen, and I'm a co-chair of Young Legal Aid Lawyers. Tonight, we're going to be hearing from four brilliant journalists: Alexandra Heal, Amelia Gentleman, Mirren Gidda, and Nick Wallis, about their work exposing injustice and their thoughts on the interaction between journalism and the law. In a moment, I'm going to introduce them more properly, but first, I just want to give a brief overview of the festival. So this is the third year of Young Lawyers Making Change, and it's our first virtual outing. The aim of the festival is to encourage and inspire social welfare lawyers of the future and begin to build a network of like-minded junior lawyers who are committed to working in areas of law which have been supported by legal aid. It's a collaboration between the Public Law Project, the Justice First Fellowship, and Young Legal Aid Lawyers. The Public Law Project is a charity which aims to improve access to public law remedies through research and strategic litigation. And I'd just like to extend my thanks to Amelia, who's the Public Law Project events the Justice First Fellowship was established by the Legal Education Foundation to support the next generation of students who want to pursue a career in social welfare law. Each year it teams up with firms and chambers to create placements for individuals to train to become solicitors and barristers. This year's application window opened on Monday, and there are 19 training contracts this year at social welfare firms and law centres around the country. Finally, Young Legal Aid Lawyers, or YLAW, exists to represent the voice of junior lawyers committed to practicing in those areas of law, both criminal and civil, which have traditionally been publicly funded. We campaign for a sustainable legal aid system which provides good quality legal help to those who can otherwise not afford to pay. We also campaign to increase social mobility and diversity within the sector and to promote the interests of new entrants into the profession. If you're following the event on Twitter or on social media, the hashtag is YLMC2020. And this is the nearly final event of the festival, but all of the panels have been recorded and they're going to be uploaded to the website. So don't worry if you haven't managed to catch them all. So that's that. In terms of tonight, we're going to hear from each of the speakers for about 10 to 12 minutes each, and then the panel will take your questions. It's going to be Alexandra, Amelia, Mirren, and Nick in that order. Alexandra has to head off a little bit early, so if you have any questions for her specifically, please can you put them in the Q&A box and she can answer them directly after her talk. So then on to our brilliant panel, and I'm just so pleased that they have agreed to come along tonight, and I hope everyone's not too zoomed out. So first speaker this evening is Alexandra Heal. Alexandra is a journalist with the Bureau for Investigative Journalism, and she worked for the Bureau on domestic abuse by police officers, won the Private Eye Paul Foot Award 2020, and led to lawyers at the Centre for Women's Justice submitting a nationwide super complaint with police regulators. And prior to working at the Bureau, she freelanced for BBC News abroad and in the UK, and also for The Guardian. Amelia Gentleman probably needs no introduction. She is a multi-award-winning Guardian journalist, and she famously uncovered the scandal of West Indian immigrants and their families being threatened with deportation, subsequently writing The Windrush Betrayal, exposing the hostile environment. She went to Oxford University for reporting in New Delhi for the International Herald Tribune, and then moved to The Guardian. In late 2017, she received an initial email tip-off, which led to 6 months work charting the Windrush scandal, leading ultimately to the resignation of the Home Secretary, Amber Rudd. She's won some of the most prestigious awards in British journalism, including the Orwell Prize, the Paul Foot Award, and the Cutlip Award. Mirren Gidda is an investigative journalist at Liberty Investigates. Prior to joining Liberty, she worked as the storytelling and digital media manager at the International Human Rights Organization, Syria Campaign, where she worked to uncover human rights abuses in Syria and tell it to a wider audience. She's an award-nominated journalist, and she began her career as an intern at Time magazine before taking a place on the BBC's journalism training scheme, where she trained in television and radio reporting. Her focus at Liberty includes policing and counter-terrorism, and she retains an interest in the UK's prison system. Last but not least, we have Nick Wallis. Nick was working as a breakfast show presenter for BBC Surrey in 2010, when a cab driver told him his pregnant wife had been sent to prison for a crime she didn't commit. As Nick found out, she wasn't alone. In the 15 years after it rolled out its Horizon IT accounting system, the Post Office prosecuted hundreds of subpart postmasters and counter workers for theft, fraud, and false accounting, criminalising and ruining people on the basis of IT evidence. Many of those convictions now appear likely to be unsafe. Nick spent the last 10 years documenting the scandal, working in his own time to get ad hoc commissions, crowdfunding his output, and eventually co-writing a private eye special, presenting an episode of Panorama and a 10-part series for BBC Radio 4. Earlier this year, the story was described in Parliament as one of the worst disasters in public life since the contaminated blood scandal. More recently, Nick has been covering the Johnny Depp trial. I think that's everything from me, and I'd like to invite Alex to take us off. Thanks.
Hi, thank you for the introduction, Lucy, and thank you very much for inviting me on. So just to give you a bit of background to start with about where I work, it's the Bureau of Investigative Journalism. We are a non-profit public interest media organisation set up about 10 years ago after the last financial crash in order to address the demise of investigative journalism in mainstream newsrooms, which were suffering from major advertising cuts and therefore budget cuts. We're philanthropically funded at the moment anyway, and all of our stories that we do, we give free of charge for co-publication with mainstream newspapers and broadcasters to ensure that they're seen by as many people as possible. So that's just kind of background on what I do, where I work, and in terms of the issue that I'm here to talk about. So for the last 2 years, I've been reporting on domestic abuse by police officers. Quite a niche kind of topic, but one that hadn't really been looked at as a kind of issue in itself before, at least in the media. And so it's about domestic abuse by police officers and forces closing ranks to protect their colleagues in the boys club, as many would call it. I found so many cases where police either don't investigate fellow colleagues who are suspects of domestic abuse at all, so they don't do any investigation, or if they do a really shoddy job, essentially, and sometimes in some cases the colleagues of the abuser or the suspect become involved in further intimidating the victims. So the stories were mainly about bad forces rather than bad officers, but I also did find many cases of the perpetrators abusing their policing positions to intimidate their wives or partners, and in my case, in all of these cases it was women, but obviously it could be men too, but intimidating them into not reporting the abuse, saying I'll get you thrown in prison, I know the legal system better than you, the force is a family and they'll protect me. I think in pretty much every case the abuser said that. And in some really outrageous cases, these threats turn out to be true. One woman who found the courage to report the abuse to her partner's force later found out the investigating officer was on the same football team as her husband, and that was kind of emblematic of a lot of cases. And another woman was repeatedly arrested at the hands of her officers, of her abuser's colleagues, including in the middle of the night. And in every case I came across, the internal investigations into the suspects resulted in no discipline whatsoever, and they found that there had been no misconduct. In many cases this was because it was done in their private life, it was seen to not impinge on their roles as police officers. I found there were more than 4 reports a week of police officers or staff abusing their partners at home, and less, and that's probably a conservative figure because obviously many of them wouldn't report it, and less than 1 in 10 of reports resulted in any meaningful discipline, like a kind of formal, a dismissal, a reprimand, or a formal warning. So that's just kind of a rough overview of the story. In terms of the kind of key questions of this panel, firstly, how journalism can be used to advance a social justice agenda. Personally, I think the role of journalism is very specifically to highlight issues to the public. It's really, in 2 words, sharing information, which sounds pretty boring if you put it like that, but what our job is to try and share the information so that the people with the power to act on it can, if they wish to. So that be that politicians, lawyers, campaigners, the communities affected if they want to mobilise on it. I think also a key part of our role is really to embarrass people in power into doing something. It doesn't have to necessarily be seen by millions, but it's the thought by the people in power that if they think that lots of people are seeing it, then that might spur them on to doing something. I don't think journalists should stop the minute a story is published. I think we should really try and make the time to ensure that it's put in front of people who are in positions to act. So, sending it to MPs who are working on, sending the article to MPs who are working on this kind of area, saying, oh, just checking if you saw this, or sending it to lawyers working in the area, submitting briefings to parliamentary kind of to Parliament about it, offering to present the story, the findings at events with relevant people there. We did that on my domestic abuse stories, and it ended up with me presenting it to one of the all-party parliamentary groups on domestic abuse. And obviously with some stories, the journalists wouldn't need to do that. They just get, I'm sure Amelia, after the Windrush scandal, didn't need to email people with the findings, and she just got invited to do it. But I think in any story you do, if you think that you want it to be seen by people, then you should make sure that they have and try and send it around. So yeah, in terms of working with lawyers, I have worked with lawyers a lot on this topic. So my relationship with lawyers started when I approached numerous police action lawyers to ask if they had represented any women who'd been abused by police officers. And 2, in the end, put me in touch with their clients. And one of them was Harriet Wistrich. I'm sure many of you probably know of Harriet's work. She set up the Centre for Women's Justice and represented women in many high-profile cases, including John Warboys, the Met spy cop scandal, and most recently Sally Challen. So she's really a force to be reckoned with. But so I did work with her pre-publication. I got, as I said, she introduced me to her client, but also she gave me various quotes for the piece and helped me interpret my findings. But really, it truly started after the story was published. So the day my first story on this was published, she tweeted saying, "I'm seriously thinking about launching a super complaint about this." And I had no idea what that was, and it turns out that it's a mechanism launched a couple of years ago to allow designated organisations to complain about widespread institutional issues in policing that apply to multiple forces. So anyway, I just mentioned this to my editor, and she said, "Oh, why don't you set up a meeting with Harriet and offer to share, all your information with her?" So I did, and I said, "I've got all this FOI data, I've done all these interviews, and I checked with my sources, and all of them wanted to be put in touch with her to be part of this super complaint." And so I just offered to, share everything I had with, as long as I had permission. And then within days, she'd appointed another solicitor at the centre, Noga Ofer, to write and lead on the complaint. And that was last summer, and then the complaint was submitted eventually this March, and now the 3 main police regulators, so the Independent Office for Police Conduct, Her Majesty's Inspectorate of Constabulary, and the IOPC are all investigating it officially now, and then they'll have to come back, I don't know when, but at some point with policy recommendations, well, hopefully anyway. So that's kind of how the super complaint came about, and I think from that, it's probably really obvious that, you know, journalists, we need lawyers. We need them for finding sources, potentially finding evidence of things, and for their experts' opinions, you know, both as background interpreting the findings, but also as quotes in the piece. So we really need lawyers, but I also think that journalists can help lawyers too. I haven't been a journalist for that long, as you can probably tell, but my editor is always saying that getting journalists to report on, you know, on an ongoing civil case can really help the case along. And I think that, you know, it's just the mechanism of showing to the people involved in the case that the country is watching, or, you know, the local community is watching, or whoever the story might target. And so whatever the outcome might be, we'll be aware of it. And I think hopefully that will apply to the super complaint. You know, I think hopefully the reporting around it and the publicity of this issue will mean that the police regulators might take more notice and, you know, of it than if the centre were to submit a super complaint without it, because they will be aware of that whatever the outcome, I'll be reporting on it. So hopefully that will help. And in terms of the kind of the relationship between lawyers, campaigners and journalists, and how to manage impartiality, obviously it's really important for journalists to try to be as impartial as we can, because of our, you know, it's just in terms of our role as information sharers, it's really important for ongoing credibility. And we're never going to be fully impartial, because it would be, you know, we're all human, and it would be weird to report on a topic and spend so long investigating it and writing about it if you didn't want it, the problem to be fixed. But I think it's our goal, it's our kind of role to try and be as impartial as possible about how we report it, and, you know, when we are kind of reporting on what the various factors are causing this issue, how much of an issue it actually is, what the solutions could be. That's when we need to try and talk to as many different people with as many different viewpoints to reflect that in the story. But I think in terms of when we're working with lawyers and campaigners, I think it's just really important that we define our role very much as the information sharer and nothing else. So with the super complaint, for example, we were never, the Bureau and myself were never going to be officially part of the super complaint. We were never going to be named on it or anything. And I just said, you know, I will share my information with you, and it's up to you what you do with it. They did ask me my opinion on what kind of arguments they should make in the super complaint and what were the key issues that they should address. And I gave them my opinion from the perspective of somebody who'd been looking into this issue for a year by that point. But I didn't, you know, it was up to them if they wanted to include that, and it was up to them as to how they formed the arguments and things like that. So I just think it's really important to make sure that there is that boundary, in order just to, because we all have different roles, and it's about preserving those roles. So yeah, I mean, that's all I have to say at the moment. Hopefully that's just a bit of an insight into what I've been doing.
Thank you so much. That was really, really interesting. There's one question that's come in. I wondered if I could just ask you something really briefly as well. First was just, how did you first come across the story?
Yes, so it was a family friend who just mentioned to me that she knew somebody who had been abused by a police officer, and this woman had reported him to his force, which was the force area that they live in, so it was the force that she would have to report any domestic abuse to. And she'd reported it, and they'd done literally nothing about it. And so I kind of thought, if that's happened to one person, I wonder if it's happened to lots of others. That woman didn't actually, oh sorry, that was my timer to make sure I didn't go over. That woman didn't actually want to speak to me. She was also a fellow police officer herself, which is another kind of thing, another area of interest. But she was also a police officer herself, so she was still working for the force, and she didn't want to risk her job, so that's why she didn't want to talk to me. But and that's why I set about kind of calling police action lawyers to ask if they'd worked with anyone, and also phoning domestic abuse charities all around the country, and ended up coming across a lot of cases. So I've now spoken to probably at least 25 women, but the Centre for Women's Justice, with their super complaint, they've now been contacted by or spoken to over 100 women who this has happened to. So yeah.
Wow. So the question that's come through is from Amala, and it's, says, in terms of working with lawyers and being put in touch with their clients, where does confidentiality come into this? What risks might there be for lawyers sharing information on their clients, or the impacts on lawyers being known for working with journalists? I don't know.
Yeah, a few things in response to that. So firstly, I always said to the lawyers, it can be completely confidential and completely anonymous if that's what the woman wants. So it was always on their clients' terms as to how they would be portrayed or kind of referred to in the story. And also, I've always said, you know, if they want to talk to me on background to start with, you know, agreeing to talk to me does not mean that they will appear in the story. So they had the right to withdraw their interview or their quotes or anything whenever they wanted, because obviously in a lot of these cases the women were vulnerable. They had PTSD or other issues as a result of having been abused at home for so long. So that was always kind of that's what I always said. Interestingly, every single woman I've spoken to has wanted to go on the record, or where they could, they've wanted to. But the problem is with domestic abuse is that, firstly, in terms of their safety, that's really tricky because of, you know, their ex-partners, but also in terms of libel. If you're accusing somebody of domestic abuse, you know, that is a huge libel risk. So that's why we weren't able to. Yeah, and I think that that's just really important to be aware of. And in terms of the risks for their clients, obviously that is something that has to be thought about, especially if the client is vulnerable. I think it's about potentially talking to the journalist a lot before, not a lot, but, you know, talking to them before you introduce them to your client to ensure that you trust them and that they won't working out if they're the kind of journalist who will just pick them up, use them and drop them, or if they're the journalist who actually cares a lot about it and will try and be as sensitive and caring as possible when working with that source.
Absolutely, that was a great answer. I think it's really tricky in kind of areas of law where you have very vulnerable clients, because there's such great injustices, but often they're not willing to do publicity because of the risk that it exposes them to. But it's, you know, I feel like sometimes it's publicity is the thing that makes the difference. I think that might be something that Amelia might touch on in terms of people who are affected by a windrush. Yeah. Got one other question for you, Alex, from Athena. She says, hello, I was wondering what are the most helpful things that lawyers can do to aid journalists in investigative journalism?
Ooh, very open question. I think the best thing is just sending tips. So if you have a story, or you have a case, and you think it would really benefit from some publicity, or even if you don't, and you know, or if it's a case you can't take on, for example, but you still think, oh, this is a really important issue that the public should know about, sending tips to journalists, I think is just like the best thing that you could possibly do. And I think finding a journalist who has covered this kind of topic before or something similar is the best way to make sure they take notice. And when you do that, I would say introducing yourself and who you are and summarizing the story in, you know, a couple of paragraphs, and not, I've had cases where people have emailed me out of the blue with like reams and reams of documents and like such a long email, and I'm like, oh my god, how am I going to go through all of this when I have no idea if this is even something that's of interest. So just being really concise and yeah, very much picking the journalists who are already kind of working in that area. I think that's the best thing that you can possibly do, really, is sending tips, really. Yeah.
Yeah, I do think that lawyers are not always the best communicators. Like, think something that we think is like well phrased or whatever, like it just wouldn't mean anything to like the average person.
It is funny finding that, like, some of the quotes that lawyers gave me for my pieces, they were just so jargony, and we have to kind of just try and like make them a bit more understandable for us heathens. But yeah, that's where we can work together though.
Okay. Great, thank you. Okay, that's a question that's for everyone. I don't know if you want to answer that, Alex.
I'm just reading it now. Interesting question. So I'll just say what it was. So it's, to what extent have threats of defamation proceedings prevented you from publishing public interest pieces? So it's never, as I said, I haven't been a journalist for that long, but it's never prevented me from publishing stuff, but it has meant watering stuff down annoyingly sometimes. So we worked with the BBC on the first story I did on this topic, and one of the cases we really wanted to name the force involved, and the BBC were kind of too timid in terms of libel risk to name the force because of the risk of identifying the man as the abusive man. So we didn't in the end, and it was quite interesting that the Bureau, which is like a really small non-profit, you know, was willing to take that risk, but the Bureau with masses of budget for, well, compared to us anyway, for legal stuff wasn't. But I guess they feel like they have to be careful being who they are. But yeah, so we have had to roll stuff back, and I'm, outside of what I do on this police domestic abuse issue, I am on the environment team at the Bureau, and for the last 2 years we've been covering deforestation in the Brazilian Amazon mainly caused by this huge, the world's biggest meat company, and they are getting really cross with us now for having covered them a lot recently, and we haven't rolled back anything, but because I think I've got very good editors who are willing to take those risks, but you know, you have to be so certain that you've got the evidence and that you're willing to back it up. But yeah, as I said, on the police side of things, I have had to roll stuff back a bit, but I've never not published anything. I don't know how common that is, but I'm sure I'll find out.
Okay, well, thanks so much, Alex. I think we're going to move on now to Amelia. And yeah,
thank you.
Hi. That was so interesting. I'm really, really glad to hear that. And so much of what you were talking about, I absolutely agree with. So I want to talk a bit about how I found working with lawyers on the 2-year investigation I did on Windrush, and which I'm still working on. That story came to The Guardian via an immigration law centre in Wolverhampton. So the person who got in touch with me wasn't a lawyer, but it was essentially from an organisation where all of the members of staff were looking at immigration cases and were very, very heavily immersed in immigration law, and almost so immersed that it kind of, to the outside, certainly to me initially, the kind of issues that they were dealing with were incredibly complex, and you know, really needed a journalist to mediate. So this was a charity based in Wolverhampton called the Refugee and Migrant Network that was helping probably thousands of people every year with their immigration status, and they got in touch with me in 2017 in about November, because one of the people who they were helping, a woman called Paulette Wilson, had been arrested and was being told that she was being deported back to Jamaica. Paulette had arrived in Britain as a 10-year-old from Jamaica and had lived in Britain for 50 years and had never left the country, didn't have a passport, had never broken the law. So this organisation was very, very concerned about why it was that she had been arrested, and she'd in fact been arrested twice, and why she was being held in Yarlswood Immigration Removal Centre. So they emailed me, and that is pretty much the standard way that I kind of get alerted to stories. But probably, like all of the panelists here, my work inbox is a kind of really badly managed sea of people coming forward and saying, you know, think about this, write about this, this is important. But that email that I got from that organisation was so arresting, because they really summed up the story in the subject tagline, which I think is a really good tip if you're trying to get a hold of people's attention. And I think the tagline said something like imminent deportation of a British grandmother after 50 years. And that was enough really to arrest my attention and make me think that it was something definitely worth writing about on its own merits. As a result of writing about Paulette, I began to get a lot of emails from other family members of people who have been similarly caught up in the hostile environment and told that they were illegal immigrants, even though most of them had been in the UK for 4 or 5 decades and had led entirely law-abiding lives in Britain and had assumed that they were British citizens. So we began to publish those stories in The Guardian one by one, and it had kind of a slow but very constant snowballing effect, whereby we'd publish, we'd show that there was somebody else who had also been arrested by the Home Office, who was also being told that they were facing imminent deportation, despite the fact that they were living here apparently entirely legally. And all the way along, so this kind of first stage of reporting lasted for about 6 months before it really gained any noticeable political traction. So I think for me it was very, very frustrating to begin with, because we published a lot of stories before there was an understanding by the government that there was a mistake, and I think fairly, to be fair, it wasn't obvious either to me or to the lawyers working on these cases at the beginning that this was a systemic problem and a problem that was affecting thousands of people. It was just at the beginning clear to a number of lawyers around the country that they were noticing this strange problem, whereby people who were here apparently entirely legally were getting these letters from the Home Office telling them that they were here as irregular migrants and weren't allowed to work, and that their employers were going to face fines of £20,000 if they employed them, and they weren't allowed to rent properties, otherwise their landlords would face fines, and they weren't allowed to access free NHS healthcare. So I worked over those 6 months with a lot of lawyers who got in touch, and I think it would be fair to group the lawyers that I worked with, well, the lawyers who were involved, into 2 groups. There was a group of people who were incredibly helpful to their clients, who worked extraordinarily long hours and did an enormous amount of pro bono work for the people in this category, because they understood that there was a serious systemic problem. And they were often doing that without any legal aid, because legal aid for immigration cases was largely cut in around 2012 as part of the legal aid reforms. So there was that really, really amazing group of lawyers who was doing that work. And then I came across a kind of less helpful group of lawyers who I found had given very, very poor and expensive immigration advice to a lot of these people who weren't amazingly helpful to me, and there's no reason why they should be, because they're kind of busy and overworked organizations and individuals. But it was quite interesting to me that there were really amazing lawyers who were kind of going over and above what they needed to do, and also some lawyers who just weren't very helpful, and particularly were unhelpful to the people who had been paying their savings to them. But on the positive side, without the help of lawyers like Jim Wilson in Wolverhampton, who'd taken on Paulette Wilson's case, or Jacqueline Mackenzie, who's done an extraordinary amount of work for Windrush victims in the last 2 years, who got in touch to tell me about the case of a man called Dexter Bristol, who had similarly arrived from the Caribbean as a child, and who had actually died in the spring of 2018, shortly after being told that he wasn't allowed to work, and I think also losing his housing. And she was very convinced that the two events, that his death and his classification as an illegal immigrant, were connected. Somebody called Jeremy Bloom with Duncan Lewis, who had been representing a man called Sylvester Marshall, who again had arrived as a child in the UK from Jamaica entirely legally in the 1960s, but who'd been told in around 2013 that he was here illegally, and told that unless he could prove that he had a British passport, he would have to pay £54,000 for his NHS treatment. And at the time he was he'd been prescribed emergency radiotherapy for cancer treatment. So Jeremy Bloom had been working on his case with Duncan Lewis for a number of months, and in that case and in a number of the others, the kind of cooperation between journalist and lawyer was incredibly effective in forcing a relatively swift resolution of the case, because with Sylvester Marshall, Jeremy Bloom, his lawyer, didn't have the funding to pursue a very complicated case. But the moment that the piece went into The Guardian and there was a kind of almost immediate public outcry about the refusal of NHS care to this man who obviously needed it quite urgently, within something like 48 hours, a decision on whether or not the lawyer should get exceptional funding to pursue the case, a decision which she'd been waiting on for, I think, 3 months, suddenly came through, and he had no doubt that the two were connected. So yes, there's no doubt in my mind that it can be incredibly useful, it can be incredibly productive for lawyers to contact journalists and to ask for coverage of their cases. I can talk a bit about the sort of precautions that a lot of lawyers take, and which I'm very supportive of. I think as a lawyer, if you're talking to a journalist, you need to be not afraid about setting out what the ground rules are. You need to obviously put your client's interest first, and if your client wants to be anonymous, then a journalist will try and persuade you otherwise. But ultimately, most thoughtful journalists will absolutely understand that some people don't want to be named. It isn't helpful for them to be named, and there are a number of ways that you can kind of compromise on that. And with Sylvester Marshall, for example, we didn't call him that name initially because he was very worried. His lawyer was very worried that that might have a detrimental impact on his claim, and so we gave him a pseudonym, and we said in the paper it was a pseudonym, but we did publish his picture because it was really clear that it makes a kind of exponential difference in terms of attracting people's interest and making readers understand that these are real people that we're writing about. I think well, there's so much to say, and I don't want to go over my time, but in terms of something that was talked about earlier about the kind of role of a journalist, and I'm very, very nervous and wary about the term of being a campaigning journalist, and I think it's quite I don't kind of think of my job as a job to campaign on issues, or I don't think I have a mission to advance a social justice agenda, because I think once you get into that category, you're you're well, you're quite likely to kind of annoy your readers, and I think my first responsibility is to be providing readers with information, and not to be kind of endlessly banging them on the head with kind of campaign material. I think it's our job to be much more kind of neutral and impassive, but at the same time, you know, clearly in a lot of the work that I've done, I have been kind of looking at areas of policy that look very much as if they need to be revised. So it's a subtle distinction, but yeah, I don't think I call myself a campaigning journalist. Yeah, I could go on, but maybe we can talk more with questions.
Yeah, brilliant. Thank you so much, Amelia. Should we move on now to Mirren?
Yeah, sure. Hi, everyone. It's so weird not being able to see your faces. Yeah, so my name's Mirren. I work for Liberty Investigates. Sorry, I'm really croaky today. Liberty Investigates is the editorially independent journalism unit within Liberty. And we're quite new. We started in October. We had all these really exciting investigations planned for you guys, and then coronavirus happened and we had to pivot very swiftly to covering that. And we actually launched in April, which was the best time to be launching in the middle of a pandemic. So what I've been working on at the moment is some stuff around the coronavirus fines, which is what police have been giving to people for supposedly violating lockdown. And I've been looking specifically at ethnic disproportionality within them. So this story kind of came about because a colleague of mine at Liberty said to me, oh, the NPCC are publishing figures for the fines that forces have been given out. And I had a quick look at them, and they had given an ethnic breakdown, and it just seemed off, because although it seemed broadly in line with the ethnic makeup of the country as a whole, it was rural forces who were giving out the highest number of fines. And so I did some data analysis, did some digging. Basically, it turned out the NPCC's initial data publication had been wrong, and that when you do the data analysis, there was quite extreme ethnic disproportionality. So that's what the first article was about. So it's looking at the fines as a whole and saying, you know, BAME people are being fined disproportionately, unfairly. And we co-published that with The Guardian. So we're very similar to the Bureau in that we do this co-publishing model that Alexandra talked about earlier. And then it was a really weird one, because I mean, I always think everything I write is rubbish, and this actually did very well. And I think it came about at a good time, in that because of the Black Lives Matter movement, you know, people are talking about issues around race and are more cognizant of it. And the findings that we had were used by Big Brother Watch and lawyers and NGOs in a letter that was sent to the head of the NPCC asking for a review into the fines. And that sort of core demand was picked up by the Home Affairs Select Committee, who started calling on the NPCC to give us the breakdown of the fines by police force. And I was asked to speak at the Home Affairs Select Committee about this. That coincided with the second article, which was I did freedom of information requests to all of the police forces to say, give me your fines broken down by ethnicity, because that seemed like the logical next step to try and find out, if you like, who the worst offenders were. And that, again, was also co-published with The Guardian. And those findings have been used by campaigners, by politicians, to kind of call for accountability. And the NPCC has actually said it's going to be looking into the fines and also looking at how it can better deal with racism or racial disproportionality among police forces. So yeah, that's a probably quite long overview of my work. In terms of Liberty Investigates, we're quite a new model of journalism in that we're based within an NGO, and we actually have a very clear focus on impact, whereas, you know, coming from a more traditional journalistic background, we didn't really think about impact in the same way. It was great if a story went further than just being read, but we were much more focused on how many people have read the article, what was the engagement, you know, that kind of like raw data. So, I mean, there are huge benefits to being based within an NGO. We're not pressured by how many people have read it. It's much more about what did it achieve. Our funding is relatively secure, and also our work can go a lot further because we've got teams within Liberty that can push it further. So if I write something and my colleague has a meeting with an MP and it's related to their portfolio, she can bring it up to the MP, or our legal team might decide that they actually want to take it further and make a case out of it. I mean, there are also negatives though with this sort of new model. The biggest one being that we're not seen as, or we might not be seen as, editorially independent. That's something we were really worried about with this co-publishing model, that we would say go to somewhere like The Guardian and they would be like, there's no way we're publishing this is just PR. I mean, thankfully that hasn't happened, and I think we've been able to prove that we are separate. The other thing is, coming from Liberty, we have faced immediate hostility from certain parts of government, from certain members of the police. The Home Office from the get-go have not really engaged with us. But that's fine, because also having the Liberty name does give us access to lawyers, and we have trust among NGOs, so it's sort of give and take. I mean, Amelia made the point about feeling uneasy about, you know, being considered a campaigning journalist, and I would absolutely agree with that. So as much as we do think about impact and try and like bake it into our work from the beginning, I don't think we would consider ourselves campaigning journalists either. I think the fundamental difference really between campaigners and journalists is that as journalists, we might have a hunch, you know, we might think these fines seem ethnically disproportionate, but we're going to investigate it. And if it happens that along the journey we find out that that's not the case, or that it's not as strong as we thought, we would drop the story, or we would include that in the story. Whereas campaigners, and this is absolutely not a criticism, will have a very key or core idea in mind. For example, like, I don't know, let's repeal the Coronavirus Act, and they will be seeking just to achieve that. And it's a very different way of thinking, and a very different way of sort of collecting your evidence. And we, within Liberty Investigates, are journalists first and foremost, and we certainly don't talk about our work in terms of campaigns either. So yeah, I mean, like all journalists, we're restricted by impartiality and objectivity, which is how it should be. But you know, like I said, we've got this added benefit of having the Liberty teams to help us reach a wider audience. I think, you know, we're still working out actually how best to work with Liberty teams, particularly with Liberty's lawyers, and I think this is probably most relevant to the people at this talk. Liberty, for those of you that don't know, has in-house lawyers that bring cases and also intervene in cases. So we were involved in the recent facial rec decision. We intervened in the Shamima Begum case. And for us as journalists, it can be a bit frustrating, because we know that they've got all these amazing cases that often we don't know about because of client confidentiality until everyone else hears about them. And one thing we were really mindful of when we started is that there was real potential for our work to conflict with theirs. So for example, if they were working on a case that we might not know too much about, and we published an article that somehow undermined that case, or could be misinterpreted as we had knowledge about that case, it could really scupper things. So we're still trying to work out how to strike that relationship. And fortunately, there haven't been any issues, there haven't been any clashes. The way we've worked with them is so far like very collaborative. So we've helped them with drafting their FOIs. When I've had particularly belligerent responses back, I've often asked them for advice. I've been speaking to our lawyers as well about the possibility of challenging an FOI in the courts, which is something that we would be doing together. So, I mean, I think when you look at sort of how journalists and lawyers can work together, we are so similar in how we work and how we think. Like, lawyers will often talk about having a lead case, you know, and having like the perfect client, which can sound quite cynical, but that's often how journalists think about things as well. Like, when I am writing an article and I want to illustrate it with a case study, I'm looking for the right case study in the same way that lawyers are. You know, both journalists and lawyers are very methodical. You know, we gather evidence, we construct an argument. I think, and the other panelists have already talked about this, but I think there is a fundamental tension between journalists and lawyers, because lawyers are always aware of the fact that journalists can ruin a trial for them or ruin a case for them. And I think what I would encourage lawyers to do is to work with journalists and find journalists that you can trust. I would say you can probably trust everyone on this panel. You can definitely trust me. But journalists do understand, and journalists should understand the boundaries and know how to sort of stay within them. But the benefit of approaching a journalist is, of course, you can get publicity for your client. Also, I think lawyers sometimes aren't aware, because they're working with an individual, that this could be part of like a systemic issue, and bringing journalists in can sometimes allow them to find that systemic issue, allow for more potential clients to come forward. I think there is tremendous potential and power in lawyers and journalists working more closely together, and I would love to see that happen more. I have no idea how long I've spoken for, but I'm going to wrap it up.
This is your 2-minute warning.
I'll wrap it up, and if there are any questions, very happy to answer them.
Great, thank you so much, Mirren. Really great to hear from you and about Liberty Investigates. I think we'll have Nick next, and then we'll have some questions, if that's all right.
Okay, hi everyone. Thanks very much for having me on the panel. I've learned a huge amount in the last hour myself, so this has been a privilege to be here. I started as a journalist at the BBC. They actually trained me up. So I've been a broadcast journalist for pretty much all of my career. I went freelance from the BBC in 2004 and sort of flitted around doing various bits and bobs. And it was only when I picked up the breakfast show at BBC Surrey, which was an interesting job, that I sort of got less interested in the fluffier side of journalism and more interested in the power of journalism to positively change people's lives for the better. And it was particularly giving a voice to people who don't normally have a voice. It seemed to be a great way of redressing the balance of power when you had individuals who were fighting what usually tended to be a faceless bureaucracy. You would be able to speak to the person at the top on their behalf, or put them directly in contact with them, and hear what they had to say play out in real time. So I got more and more interested in it, and then I had the stroke of luck of coming across the post office story while I was at BBC Surrey, and I took it to my boss, who said, "Why don't you take it to Jane French who's the editor at Inside Out South? She's brilliant editor, and I'm very sad that she's retired now." And she immediately saw the value of the story and said, "Right, I'm going to put my 2 best people on it. You can present it. Off you go, sunshine." And through what was already in the public domain, as well as our own investigation, we were able to uncover a number of postmasters who had been put through the mill by the post office. And I left BBC Surrey. It's usually a sort of it's usually very difficult to get a local story away on network television or radio, and by network I mean BBC National. And I knew that and I did try and interest the likes of Newsnight, and actually the one person to get back to me was Alexandra's boss, Mirren, who was working for Newsnight at the time, and he said, "Well, come back to me when you've got a new development, and we'll do something about it." So I thought, well, how am I going to get this story away, because it stuck with me. And so I went to Private Eye, and on the second bite of the cherry, they came back to me and said, "Yeah, no, this is a good story. We ought to do something on this." And so began a 9-year relationship with Private Eye magazine, which taught me a lot about the way newspaper and magazine journalism, print journalism works. and how you can get certain things into the public domain that you couldn't necessarily get across as a straight up piece of broadcast journalism. But it was I'd left the BBC Surrey. I was making crime programs for Channel 5, which were sort of a bit crash bang wallop but great fun. And the money that gave me afforded me the time and space to go back to some of the people involved in this post office story and talk to them, because they were still communicating with me saying, well, nothing's happening on this story, what can we do? And I didn't have an outlet for it. I couldn't get it away at all. So I just started blogging about it, and that had a very niche audience, but a committed one. And through being able to just put stuff in the public domain for free on a blog platform, got more and more people interested in the story, particularly some of the key players who came out of the woodwork and started potentially telling me things they shouldn't, which gave my journalism more value, which meant that I could take it to more traditional outlets and get things away. For instance, the panorama that we did in 2015 on the story. And subsequent to that, it developed into the massive litigation, which I imagine some of the people watching this seminar would have heard about. Bates and Others versus Post Office, a huge class action in the High Court, which culminated in a settlement in which the Post Office handed over tens of millions of pounds to the litigants and an apology. The story keeps developing. It turns out that the Post Office went about prosecuting 900 people over the course of 15 years between 1999 and 2014, in which IT evidence was part of their case, and the whole can of worms has really exploded over the last 8 or 9 months, and it's kept me busy, and it's kept more and more lines about this story coming out. But in terms of and what it has done is also helped my journalism. It's helped the stuff that I do as a broadcaster, which is very generalist and largely scratching the surface. And it's also brought a lot of other stories to my attention, some of which have come from lawyers. And it's very difficult as a freelancer getting stories away, because when you go to Panorama with a story, you're essentially asking them to commit £100,000 to what you say is worth investigating. It's all done on relationships, because you have to have a track record. You have to have that relationship of trust with the editor, who knows that you are a stand-up sort of person and can be trusted that what you're saying is at least worth questioning and spending the time to look into. And it is a frustration of mine, not that it's particularly relevant to you, that I find it hard that when people do come to me with copper bottom stories, that I can't necessarily find the outlet to get them away because of that high bar that broadcasting often brings. But in terms of providing information to journalists, I think Mirren's point about looking at the track record of that journalist, and Alexandra's point about looking at where they have a specialist area is essential. And there is absolutely no harm whatsoever in just picking up the phone and saying, oh, I really like your work in this area. I've got a story I think you might be interested in. I'm a lawyer working at X, and this is what I have to tell you about. And it doesn't necessarily have to be because you want to win a particular case and you want to get publicity for that case or that client. It could just be that you are working in an area and you think it's worth connecting with someone because that journalist appears to be working in that area. And it doesn't take long if you're able to build up some kind of rapport or relationship of trust, that should something really good come along, that you've done a lot of the groundwork required to persuade the journalist that it's worth taking you at your word, or it's worth taking you at the sort of on the basis of a few documents to an editor and say, look, I know this lawyer, they're really good in their field, they've been working on this area for the last 2 years, they've got a really good story that's going to come to court, or that they've just issued proceedings about, or that they've got a particular bee in their bonnet about some change to the legislation that is going to cause this injustice or this problem in this area that we should be focused on, or that our audience really cares about. And that smooths the path to getting things away, rather than sort of issuing a press release and hoping that someone bites. It is all down to relationships of trust, because you're dealing with such a huge risk for the journalist and the broadcaster. If they get the slightest thing wrong, all their credibility with their audience and the subsequent issues that come up as a result of it, and it's the same in the printed media with their regulators. They're going to get in all sorts of trouble. So it's whenever someone comes to me fresh with what they think is a story, and I have had since I did the panorama in 2020 and the private eyes special earlier this year, I've had a huge amount of stories which I really do need to triage properly and get away. I would always say to people, look, is the protagonist in this story prepared to go on the record, be filmed, have a camera pointed at their face, and tell me what you are telling me now in order for it to be made public? If they're not, what level of disclosure are they able to give me? Do they want to be anonymized? Do they want to just pass on all the facts and then let me go and find a case study for this story? Because one slight difference between, I think, printed media and broadcast media is that broadcast media focuses on individuals because it's just the way that medium works. So if you have what we call a case study, and I know case studies are incredibly important for newspapers, and pictures are essential, but we kind of live or die by them in broadcast media. So if you've got a story, if you want to issue a press release, if you want to get the BBC, ITV, Channel 4 or Channel 5 News interested in something, and I've worked for all of them except Channel 4 News, then what you have to be able to offer them beyond the story is someone who can talk about the way it's affected their life, ideally on camera with their name on the record, and someone who can provide context about it, ideally from your law firm, you yourself if you're the expert, and who is available at a moment's notice to drop everything and do some filming, usually at an inconvenient time in an inconvenient place, to very short deadlines, with an unsatisfactory outcome. But that's the kind of demands that television and radio tend to put on people. And if you sort of go into that relationship understanding that journalists have tiny attention spans, they're incredibly rushed off their feet, they are trying to juggle a million stories at once, what might be a burning priority for you isn't necessarily a burning priority for them or their editor. They will do what they can to get the story away if they believe in it, and you'll just have to sort of work within the confines of whatever they're throwing at you, because they are under-resourced, stressed, like I imagine most lawyers. But it's the sort of unique demands of broadcast media and the sort of the strange stresses that are placed on journalists that make it a particularly difficult relationship to negotiate if you're not used to it and you're not prepared for it, and don't go into it with your eyes open. So I always say to people, give me the case study. What do they want to say? Are they willing to be filmed? Can I speak to them now? Because you've got to essentially triage that case study to see whether or not they're going to make someone who can talk coherently on camera or on a radio. And then have you got the documents that we need to make this story stand up, so that our lawyers at our end are going to be satisfied that it can go to air? The first lawyer I ever properly worked with was a woman called Claire Hoban, who was the in-house BBC lawyer for I think it was the One Show, and she just basically taught me a whole new way of thinking. And I was interested that Mirren's point about lawyers and journalists thinking very similarly. That's not what I felt when I first met Claire. The way that she would look at a script and go, well, it taught me never to second guess the legal process when it comes to a broadcast script, because there were things that I would sometimes on occasion take out, because I thought, oh, the lawyer's never going to let that happen. And then it would come to the writing of the script, and the lawyer would be, oh no, you can push away at that. That's absolutely fine. And then I did a piece once on
Nick, very sorry to interrupt. This is your 2-minute warning.
I've got my 2-minute warning, so I'll just wrap up with a story about Ben Goldacre. I was very keen to get Ben Goldacre on the telly after he wrote an article for The Guardian about the vaccine issue, and there was someone who could be described as pushing anti-vaccination views on LBC. So I got an authored piece by him onto ITV London, in which he railed against media stupidity and the credulousness of people and their lack of qualifications to broadcast to the general public at a time when public trust in vaccines was going down, and this could be causing severe problems for people in the capital. And we were really having a go at this broadcaster who'd been spreading these, who've been allowing these myths to propagate, let's put it like that. And the lawyers was absolutely fine by that, but Ben also, as an example of media stupidity, quoted a Daily Mail article about radioactive paedophiles, and the lawyer, as a bit of fun, and the lawyer said that had to come out because it was potentially defamatory, and neither Ben nor I understood it, but it was an example to me of how lawyers will pick up on obviously very crucial things in their mind, because they're constantly thinking, how is this ever going to stand up in court? Whereas journalists are perhaps wanting to push the narrative a little bit more, and then get worried about saying things that are defamatory, which they don't necessarily need to be, because they can stand it up, or because it's in the balance of where the piece should be. Right, I think I've stopped making any sense whatsoever, so it's a good time in which to wrap up. But thank you very much for listening.
Thank you very much, Nick. Great, so I think we're going to take some questions now, and I would like to kick off with my own question, because I feel like I've got the dream scenario here of like all my desert island castaway guests that I'd like to put a question to, and it is kind of building on what's been covered a little bit by each of you about kind of impartiality and the role of journalists. And I'd say kind of in kind of introduction that I did actually, when I first emailed Nick about this, I said it was kind of very badly worded email that said something like, I'm really interested to hear from different journalists about the campaigns they're involved in. And quite rightly, Nick came back to me and said, I'm not a campaign journalist, that's a very different thing. And it made me realize that I guess kind of lazy language really, but that there are the different kind of roles. There's journalism, there's campaigning, there's law, and they all serve very different purposes. And I guess that there's crossover, but we all, I don't know, some things we don't want to be associated with so much for different reasons. But in terms of impartiality and the role of journalists, obviously there's been a lot of news recently about migrants crossing the channel, and a lot of people were very upset that, at least in my particular Twitter bubble, about certain news organisations filming boats coming in from their own boats, and some people thought that was just kind of unethical journalism, and I wondered what the panelists thought about kind of what the role of a journalist is, whether you can be like, where does your kind of humanity end and your impartiality start, and you're just reporting on something. I don't know if you've got thoughts on that.
Well, from my perspective, journalists should be reporting on stuff that happens. Now, you can have all sorts of debates about whether Nigel Farage was twisting the news agenda to his own purposes. The government decided to jump on it and make a thing about it, and that's what got all the news orgs into such a frenzy that they then started patrolling the channel, looking at people to film. I can see why people take that view, but if the alternative is not filming it and quietly just ignoring it, I mean, is that deserting your duty as a journalist? I think to some degree it is. Forgive me for not knowing too much about this specific story, but I think there were some figures released that were showing record numbers of migrants were trying to make the journey, and I might be wrong, and there might be people who can sort of shout me down and say that was confected by the government as well, but that was certainly what I understood to be the case. So if record numbers of people are trying to make it across the channel in flimsy boats, risking their lives at the sort of behest of criminal gangs in Calais, that's newsworthy, and you need pictures to illustrate a story, and there's nothing more visual than people in a motorboat trying to make their way across the channel on a sunny day. So I didn't have any problem with it at all. I can understand why people get very priggish about it and self-righteous, but and possibly with very good reason, with very good arguments as to why it might be damaging in some way. But by the same token, what are you going to do? Turn a blind eye, switch your cameras off, and go, well, it's happening, but we're not going to tell anyone.
Or maybe there are other ways of covering it that, you know, don't involve kind of creating big waves that might overturn a small dinghy in the water.
Did that happen?
Well, I did. I read a little bit about it earlier, and because there was lots of kind of criticism online about this happening, and lots of sharing of the, I don't know, there's some kind of code for seafarers, and that you're not meant to leave a vessel in distress. And an article on the BBC that I read said that they all that they'd notified the Coast Guard and this sort of thing.
Yeah, I mean, you know, there's ethical journalism, there's unethical journalism. If you're putting lives at risk by doing your job, then you're an unethical journalist. And I can imagine that the crews who went out there were very thoroughly briefed, very thoroughly risk assessed, worked with crews that knew exactly what they were doing. And if they did put any of those vessels at risk, then they crossed the line and there should be a complaint made. If that's people just watching the television pictures and going, you're putting those people at risk by doing that, well, then submit a complaint and Ofcom will deal with it. And Ofcom deal with things very, very thoroughly indeed. They hand down rulings which you can read every single month. And if there was any risk to any of those vessels by the broadcasters, and I don't know whether there was because I haven't seen every single picture, then Ofcom would rule against those broadcasters because you can't put lives at risk at sea.
Yeah. Mirren and Amelia, I don't know if you want to come in on this at all.
Yeah, I think it's a very difficult line to tread. I mean, as journalists, we do have to be impartial, but we do also have a duty of care to the people that we interview and the people whose stories we tell. And I know, being very candid at the start of my career, I tended to see people, you know, people in distress, victims of trauma, as article fodder. And I don't like the way that I was, you know, as a younger journalist. And what I'm very grateful for my time with the Syria campaign is it taught me that there's nothing wrong with being empathetic. You know, there's nothing wrong with reaching out to someone or showing that you care and that you're affected. It's made me a much better journalist, and it certainly isn't crossing that impartiality line. And I think sometimes, journalists make the mistake of being too removed, not because like we're callous people, but because we think that that's how we need to be. And I think that isn't really the case. And I think everyone in this panel has done work where you have to be empathetic because that's how you get people to trust you. And with regards to the example that you mentioned, Lucie, I was very uncomfortable when I saw what the camera crew had done in terms of filming that boat. I understand the point of, well, how do you illustrate the desperation? But it seemed too sort of voyeuristic, and it seemed as though it, you know, certainly what I feel as a journalist, if someone was in distress, you go and help them. That supersedes the journalism. Like, even if you lose the story or don't get the footage, you have to help people. And I think that's where duty of care comes in. And I think when there's sort of a question in your mind about, is it duty of care or is it impartiality, I think duty of care should always override it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'd like to think so too, but I can see it's very tricky. Amelia, do you want to come in on this at all, or should we move on? I don't think she can hear me.
Unmute myself. Yes, I think I'm not sure I agree about the duty of care ahead of journalism, because I haven't seen those bits of footage. But I think if you think about reporting on natural disaster or on you know, catastrophes, it's not journalists' job to be going and administering first aid. I mean, it's sort of, I haven't done much of that sort of reporting, and I imagine it's incredibly difficult. But you know, that's the point of doing the journalism is in order to alert people globally to what's going on. And you know, you're not there to be fishing people out of the sea, unfortunately. And of course, you know, if I don't know, because I haven't seen that footage. Clearly, if if it was the only, you know, if their lives were being endangered, it's a different question. But yeah, it is a really hard ethical area, and a kind of parallel area that I've encountered quite recently is the extent to which journalists should try and report on the work that border force, for example, officers are doing. And I recently went at the end of last year with a group of immigration border force officials on a raid of a Vietnamese nail bar, or a number of Vietnamese nail bars, because I've been writing for years about the trafficking of young people for exploitation in nail bars and cannabis farms, and I was really interested in seeing about how the local authorities and immigration authorities were trying to combat modern slavery. So I went on a raid with the immigration enforcement, and I wrote a piece that both enraged the immigration enforcement people who'd taken me, because it was kind of critical of what they were doing, but it also enraged quite a lot of people who felt that even standing next to immigration enforcement people was somehow being complicit with the work that they were doing. You know, and which I felt was not right, but it was quite interesting for me that there is that kind of group of that there is that opinion, I suppose.
Yeah, I mean, I guess it's kind of, what do you consider your role to be as a journalist, and if it's just your you know, I think it came up a lot earlier about kind of being you know, information sharers and shining a light on things that people wouldn't otherwise see. And I suppose, you know, through writing about that, people would have found out about what an immigration raid is like in a way that they might otherwise never have. And it, I don't know, not your part to intervene, but yeah, okay. Well, I've got a few other questions. I wondered if the rest of the panel want to come in on this question that came on quite early about defamation and whether that's affected any of you in your work. Perhaps Mirren, you've been a bit protected from it in Liberty. No?
Yeah, I saw that question. It's a really good question. I mean, I think it's always a risk, isn't it? And you guys will know as lawyers that if there's someone particularly vexatious with deep pockets, even if they don't really have the case, they can still take you to court. We try and mitigate it in terms of, we've all had legal training. We're lucky enough to have the resources to have a media lawyer who checks all of our work. We work with brilliant co-publishers like The Guardian, who obviously have their own legal processes, but the risk is always still there. And I so far haven't come up against litigious individuals, but with the police story, and this is not an example of defamation, but it is an example of someone being a bit of an obstruction, we do a thing called right of replies with our work. So it's where if an allegation is made, say against the NPCC, we go to them and we say, do you have comment? And when I went to them with my analysis, they basically said to me, we haven't been able to check all this analysis, but it's unlikely to all be correct. So could you just not publish until we publish our own figures? And it's a tricky one, because, I mean, obviously the answer is no. You would like it if they could actually give you a proper comment instead of saying you're probably wrong. But, you know, we just kind of had to make the call of, we're going to go ahead and do it. We had the data like rigorously fact checked by multiple people, and kind of figured on the balance of probabilities it would be okay. An issue with the Ministry of Justice, where they basically said that the allegations that were in the piece were false, and that was a really tough one, because you can't include a comment like that. So we had to go back and go through the piece with them and get to a point where they were happy with it. But actually, right replies are a good way to try and prevent a defamation claim, because you've at least already given someone a heads up and allowed them their chance to speak.
Sorry, I'm trying to unmute myself. I always find it slightly annoying when I read an article and it's kind of called this brilliant reporting, and then you get like the Home Office at the end being like, you know, everything we do is great, and like, I don't know what you're complaining about. It's like, oh. Anyway, Nick, Amelia, any thoughts? Oh, you're on mute, Amelia.
So sorry. Yeah, the comments that we are obliged to include from the Home Office or whichever government department, I mean, they are kind of sometimes frustratingly familiar, because there's very often one line that is repeated to the point of absurdity. But in terms of making sure that we kind of protect ourselves against any legal, I mean, not so much in the case of the government departments, but with individuals, it's essential, really, that we're very, very careful to give people that right of reply. And at The Guardian, we've got a great team of lawyers who protect us from some of these anxieties, and who are amazing, because they'll go through line by line everything, and are not averse to taking risk, but are very, very careful in highlighting where the risk is, and making sure that individual reporters and editors are, you know, on top of what they're doing.
Well, yeah, thank you.
I would just say, if you are publishing something which you have evidence for, or the person who is telling you the story, you believe it's their honestly held view, and you've done everything to reassure yourself that they are not motivated by malice, that you've offered the person or the organization that you're writing about the right of reply, an opportunity to be interviewed, to give their view, that you offer to publish, if they're not going to be interviewed, that you're going to publish as what they have to say in response to that. I think it's very hard to be sued nowadays. If you've got all your ducks in a row, and you are pretty convinced that what you're doing is in the public interest, if you haven't got the absolute cast iron evidence that you need to prove to yourself that it's true, that all the actors that you are using in the story are convinced of the truth of what they are saying, and they are saying it for the right reasons, then defamation, I think, is a receding risk after the law was changed to make the actual defamation process one of serious harm to someone's reputation. And there is also the growing power of social media, which means that if I don't think the post office would ever sue me now, I mean, given how their reputation has been shredded by the High Court judgment. But if, let's say, Fujitsu decided to, Fujitsu operate the Horizon computer system which the post office use. So let's say I started writing things about Fujitsu, and I think there is good grounds for starting to write things about Fujitsu, given that the Director of Public Prosecutions has asked the Met Police to investigate Fujitsu employees' role in this whole scandal. Fujitsu as a private company might feel a little bit more willing to chance their arm by sending legal threatening letters. Not that the post office didn't send legal threatening letters at first, but you know, they've stopped doing that now. Then social media could very quickly pick up a cause célèbre, and if a journalist was just simply having to deal with the process of answering a defamation proceeding or pre-action letters, which costs money because you have to employ lawyers to do that, then crowdfunding and appealing to people's better instincts to help you through that process has I think opened up recently as a potential avenue. And so if you have an audience for your story, and that audience believes that what you're writing is in the public interest, they're more often, well, there are examples in the past where they put their hands into their pockets to help journalists or to help people ward off people who might decide to try and bully you into silence through the courts.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, not a position that a journalist wants to be.
well, yes and no. I mean, it could generate a huge amount of publicity for the story, which is, you know, if a journalist's job is to shine a light on something, then if someone is going to be stupid enough to try and shut that journalist up using the threat of legal action, it could backfire tenfold on them.
Yeah. boy. Amelia looks like she might want to say something, or maybe she's.
Oh, I just wanted to say that yes, certainly my colleague Carol Cadwallader has faced a lot of this when she's been writing about various big internet or tech companies, and yes, she has garnered an enormous amount of support online. So yes, to your point, I think that is absolutely true.
Great. Well, I think that's pretty much it. That's all that we've got time for this evening. But I'm so grateful to all of our speakers, to Alexandra, to Amelia, to Mirren and Nick. Thank you for joining us. And I hope that you, as our audience, have enjoyed it and found it interesting. Just a really quick final shout out. A last event of our festival is tomorrow. It's starting at 5 o'clock. It's an in-conversation event between Leslie Thomas QC and Danielle Manson. They're both brilliant barristers, and it's going to be chaired by Tara Moncare, who's a really brilliant solicitor. So we hope that you'll join us. And that's it. Thank you, everybody.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.